you might recognize these names: Aleister Crowley, Howard Phillips Lovecraft. The 20th century would not have been the same without them. Relative unknowns until many years after their deaths, when their influence would explode across, well, everything really. Did Aleister Crowley give us a season of evil or a summer of love? Were Howard Philip Lovecraft's stories primarily fueled by his interest in the occult and unknown, or a byproduct of his class-driven xenophobia? You could say the 20th century fulfilled Crowley's prophesied Aeon of Horus, a time of great social upheaval, endless war, magical Darwinism, leading to an occult-driven rocket age of peace, love, and understanding. Equally true, it was an era under Lovecraft's strange stars, when civilization is unmoored by paradigm-shattering scientific, technological, and spiritual breakthroughs, providing an opening for alien gods to invade and reshape our concepts of reality. Both envisioning humanity pushed to the threshold of a dark void, filled with strange radiation that promises evolution or mutation, transformation or obliteration. They never met and only barely acknowledged one another while alive. Maybe letters still exist to be read, manuscripts to be unearthed, the dark matter of history on which we hang the lights of truth and insight. In Crowley's own words, nothingness with twinkles. But what twinkles?
I did not know that Aleister Crowley visited New Hampshire. That was actually a very exciting thing to hear, because it's in line with a lot of my Strange Maine research, where oftentimes these, out of the way New England states have surprising connections to pivotal people. I definitely have Fortean leanings. My whole body of Strange Maine work came out of inquiry into the things that didn't fit the standard histories. So I definitely have very Fortean leanings in that sense.
My name is Jerome Clark. My friends call me Jerry. When I was 12, I read the books of Charles Fort, the great satirist and anomaly collector, and my life was never the same again.
Well, I became Decatur, Illinois' first Vietnam-era conscientious objection. And what did I base that on? Not religion. I went to my draft board and I said, because I'm a Fortean, I'm not going to fight your war.
This skeptical, viewing reality as fluid, that being suspicious of dogmas and people who claim to have all the truth.
I very much identify with his looking at everything and having just a curiosity for many things. I mean, I'm very fascinated by the natural world and ecology and the native uses of plants and things like that, which you wouldn't think would necessarily have anything to do with the paranormal. But I find that it does, these larger patterns So I appreciate that, and I really like his droll sense of humor and not taking anything too seriously.
Obviously, Lovecraft was well aware of Charles Fort's work. If you say Fortean to somebody, they don't know what it means. You have to explain, well, there was this guy. His name was Charles Fort. He collected all of this wild information about rains of frogs and this and that, and he put it all into these books so people could read about it. Most people have not gone down that rabbit hole, which is Charles Fort's books are the biggest rabbit hole in the world.
Like Crowley, Charles Fort operated on the fringe and forward edge of many contemporary ideas. His work might have been interpreted as American Dada, a collaging of anomalous newspaper factoids with impossible theories that flew in the face of scientific convention. While Lovecraft openly admired Fort from afar, Crowley never mentions Fort. This despite both men occupying New York City during the war, and by some accounts, moving in the same circles. Charles Fort's primary patron was author and journalist Theodore Dreiser, whom Crowley knew through the Greenwich Village art scene. Anecdotally, Crowley claimed to have once secretly dosed Dreiser with peyote at a dinner party, recording the results in his Lost Liber, the cactus. Crowley's record of drug experiments on over 100 participants.
I do consider myself a 40. I'm a really bad one because I don't actually do all of the research, but I do like collecting the information. The information that I like to collect is much more experiential.
Recently, I've become more interested in using synchronicity as a way to experiment on the consciousness side of these strange paranormal experiences. It's very easy to do and easy to get results. At the same time, they are very jarring on an ontological or existential level, which I think is good for researchers to understand, what it's like for experiencers going through these type of situations.
All of these trips have had some level of synchronicity, whether it's paranormal or our paranoid brains bringing it into it. But I really, really want to go actually out and touch it and feel it and see what's going on in each of those places. So more roadside Fortean.
There are special harmonic areas. John Keel used to use the word window. Never really caught on outside of the field of UFOs. But if you start looking at how it's developed in the Fortean literature, people can really see that there are special areas, there's wicked areas, there's devil names, there's all of those kinds of things that seem easier for people to really digest. And it continues today.
Founding cryptozoologist and Fortean researcher Ivan T. Sanderson coined the term viral vortex in 1968. A viral vortex was a window area, similar to the Bermuda Triangle, where all kinds of strange phenomena would occur and a lot of mysterious disappearances. We were curious if the Ossipee Triangle would qualify. So we met with Sanderson's protege and leading cryptozoologist, Lauren Coleman.
If you look at where Aleister Crowley lived in different places, he had a castle-like residency on the shores of Loch Ness. And so the Lovecrafts, the Aleister Crowleys, they move around in these different places and they're sensitive to sort of the strangeness of the area. And that's what I felt around the Bridgewater Triangle, for instance. This was an area that was phenomenal. Hockomock Swamp, the Bridgewater Triangle, where a lot of phenomena was there and kind of became a magnet for certain investigators to really kind of home in.
Murder House Little, H.P. Lovecraft, Sentinel Mountain, Dunwich Horror, Mount Shaw. The Ossipee Triangle was a term coined by Ken Moak in 1988 in Info magazine. Again, as a relation to all the way going back to the Bermuda Triangle, which is a way to evaluate areas of strange phenomenon, probably within ley lines that people would say, that strange things happen. The Bermuda Triangle, planes and boats go missing. The Ossipee Triangle is one much less known, and one that is probably not well understood where the vertices actually are. And we thought, well, we're going to go and try and figure out where it actually starts and stops. The top, Cannon Mountain, site of the Betty and Barney Hill incident. Bottom is Mystery Hill. And then to the east is Mount Shaw. If you look within that, it actually includes a significant portion of Interstate 93, and that we used to guide our trip. And that we used to guide our trip. 93 being associated with Thelema, Crowley's religion, Aleister Crowley's religion.
My name is Colin Campbell, and I've been studying magic for, I think, 35 years now. I've published a number of works on it, including Thelema, which is a work about the life, work, and philosophy of Aleister Crowley. So I first started researching Aleister Crowley as kind of an offshoot of my interest in magic, which I really became interested in when I was a teenager, which really tells you just how popular it was in high school. And I followed that through in college and just kept reading more and more about it. It was a legitimately organic interest. And if you study magic long enough, sooner or later, you're going to encounter the personage of Aleister Crowley. He had this reputation in his own time as this terrible person, the beast, right? And it was self-styled. He claimed his mother called him the beast, and so he just accepted the name. He was also growing up in Victorian England and all the mores and restrictions around that, which carried over for generations thereafter as well. And if you think about it, he's a bisexual man in a time steeped in Victorian morals, who's preaching individual liberties and sexual freedoms. I mean, to them, he was the Antichrist. So he just rode with that.
If you mention Crowley to somebody who only knows him in his reputation in passing, it's generally accepted he was evil. He was manipulative. He was holding truck with dark powers in order to get who knows what out of it. Those are the tabloid type perceptions that still remain today and are frequently exploited by, book publishers, poster makers, you name it, sticker makers. Crowley is out there in the general zeitgeist as that persona.
Crowley was greeted at the docks by a newspaper person, and so Crowley was a known entity. He was, for better or worse. Often the latter, because they wanted the sensationalism. This notorious black magician stepping off the ship in New York. Yes, we're going to go take a look at what that's all about.
We realized we had a lot to learn about Aleister Crowley. But where to begin? In 2022, we headed to the Pacific Northwest to meet Crowley researcher, Dr. Rick Spence. It's hard to ignore the anomalous similarities between the Mount Rainier region and New Hampshire's Ossipee mountain range.
This is the story of a great monster whose heart lies in front of you.
From mystery mounds to weird lights and strange stone formations, these volcanically charged regions are super magnets for those things that Charles Fort would call the damn data. We couldn't help but get a little distracted. Eventually, we made it out to a remote corner of northern Idaho, where intelligence expert Rick Spence taught history. In the 1990s, Spence had turned up hard evidence of Crowley's spy connections, when the story was merely rumor and legend.
Well, hello. I'm Rick Spence. I'm a retired professor of history at the University of Idaho, which I taught at for some 34 years. I retired in 2020. Since then, I have continued to pursue my unhealthy research interests in a whole variety of things, ranging from Aleister Crowley to George Hunt Williamson to James Shelby Downard. No one easily accessible or normal. Intelligence records, for anybody who's out there who wants to do research, are very, very difficult to access. So this means that virtually every country protects their intelligence records through some sort of exemption to any kind of Freedom of Information Act. Those are records of things that were never intended to be public. Nevertheless, I knew that there was one, now defunct intelligence agency, whose records were accessible. And what that was something called the Military Intelligence Division. So back in the First World War, which the United States entered in 1917, the U.S. at that time really had no coherent intelligence structure. The MID functioned largely as the U.S. internal security apparatus, from 1917 up to the beginning of World War II. And those records had since been declassified. So you can go, and one of the things the MID did is that it created, starting in World War I, this huge card file of suspects, 200,000 names. And even if, by the way, all the documents connected to those files have since disappeared, you still have the reference cards, which contain often an interesting amount of information. Some of them are fairly detailed. So I just decided to send off a letter to the National Archives. That's what you did then. You sent letters and asked as to whether or not there were any MID files relating to Aleister Crowley or Edward Crowley, Edward Alexander Crowley, which after all is his real name and the name that in most official documents he always went by. And lo and behold, there was. So what did it have? Well, the one thing that sort of stood out to me was a report from 1918 from an MID local officer. They had officers stationed around up in the Hudson Valley, and it concerned this dubious Englishman, Aleister Crowley, who was hanging out on this island in the middle of the river. Now that's kind of odd, strange foreigner camping in the middle of the river. What's he doing there? So inquiries were made, and this sort of led to, the inquiries went back to the New York State Attorney General's office, which was acquainted with Crowley, and then eventually found its way back to the British consulate in New York. And there was the thing that I didn't expect to find, because I didn't know whether there was anything to this or not, was that, to paraphrase it, His Majesty's government is basically aware of Crowley's activities in the United States, and he is an employee of the British government there on official purposes. Well, that was it. That meant that at least part of what Crowley had been saying was true. And here was confirmation from the British consulate itself. Now, that still left a lot of big questions. It's like later, why does he end up on Esopus Island in the middle of the Hudson River? Why does he end up on Montauk Point, of all the places you were going to go? Again, is that just accidental that he's in those places to carry out those magical workings, or is there some other purpose which is mixed up in that? So why in 1916 does Crowley decide to go on a magical retreat in a cottage in northern New Hampshire around Lake Pasquaney?
Magical retirement is specifically almost like a retreat. The guru ascends the mountain and meditates, right? It's not necessarily that, but it is a retirement with a purpose. So you go and just kind of be by yourself, or with at least limited contact, to attain a specific purpose. For Crowley, he had been spending a lot of time trying to identify himself as, kind of the prophet of Thelema. And he had been working for that over quite some time, but felt like he was kind of stuck. And so as a result, he thought this was equally a good idea to kind of break the patterns that he had kind of immersed himself in.
That's his whole sort of magical purpose there. But what else is going on in New Hampshire? What could be the intelligence angle in this? Well, it is, interestingly enough, the same general area, not the Lake Pasquaney, but this is the place, for instance, where the German ambassador in the United States, Count von Bernsdorf, goes for summer recreation. So here again we go back to that New Hampshire was a vacation wonderland. It was essentially where much of the Eastern, elite would go off to spend the summer people. They're still around, aren't they? The summer people who show up, rent houses, buy stuff from the locals. All the locals simultaneously are dependent upon them and hate their guts. But nevertheless, in the summer, it's flooded with this. And Germans, again, Count von Bernsdorf, I think the military attaché in Washington, Franz von Papen, who's also heavily involved in all kinds of German espionage. He's there. This is where these people go to recreate during the summer. Now, so if you wanted to sort of casually keep an eye on what they were doing, that might be the place to do it, in the same way that doing things on summer vacation is kind of out of the of the public eye. One of the Germans that Crowley is maybe the most sort of concerned with is a Harvard professor of psychology by the name of Hugo Münsterberg. Kind of a big deal in American academic circles and in early psychological circles at the time. Crowley, early on, it actually was that he thinks that Münsterberg, this Harvard professor, is the Moriarty, the reference to Sherlock Holmes' arch nemesis, that he's the Moriarty of German intelligence or operations in America, that he's really the kind of central guy. His concern about Münsterberg is based upon something that outwardly about Hugo Münsterberg we can't see. That is occulted from view. So my suspicion is that Münsterberg's interest in the occult in a broad realm was more active or deeper than is visible. So let's just suppose that Hugo Münsterberg was, in addition to his academic affiliations, also affiliated with one or more of those German secret societies, those German occult orders. And that Crowley's concern was that Münsterberg was going to exploit those occult connections or influence. That's what was going to make him, that's what made him dangerous. Not his academic credibility, not his friendship with Teddy Roosevelt and others, but this, the same thing that gave Crowley importance, that he was in some way sort of Crowley's counterpart among the Germans. Now here's the interesting thing that we're leading up to. One of the things that happens in December 1916 is that Hugo Münsterberg dies. He is eliminated from the picture. He drops dead delivering a lecture in class. Now, they're pretty good. If you look at Hugo Münsterberg, I think this was a man who perhaps had a weight issue. He was under a lot of stress, apparently dropped dead from a massive coronary. Those things happen. But on the other hand, it was very fortuitous in some way. Crowley's quite pleased by this, that the fellow he considered to be the most dangerous German operative in America is now dead. Now, the other thing that Crowley was doing in this period is that he was doing a lot of writing. And he actually came up with what I think is some of his more interesting work in the States. He began sort of writing these detective stories. And in the central figure in it was it's him under a different name, Simon If.
It was kind of his foray into crime fiction detective kind of stuff with an idealized him as Simon If, the inscrutable detective. And they're pretty fun. One of which is actually named the Pasquini Puzzle. And the setting is specifically on a small island on Lake Pasquini. And from the location of the cottage, you can actually see a small island that clearly was the location for his fictional story.
And in these Simon If stories, there are various things sort of embedded from actual events in Crowley's life. So one of them, Simon If, is heavily involved in breaking up this whole sort of German plot. All right, and he's aided in this. Another character who sort of emerges in these stories is his kind of Girl Friday. Okay, his young female assistant, Dolores Cass. Crowley wrote any number of stories which he would fill with figures, thinly disguised figures of people he knew. Now, that's one of the ways you get back at people, right? You just, write a Roman à clef and thinly disguise them under the name and then say all the nasty things about them that would otherwise, have you end up in a defamation suit. But that was Crowley's modus operandi in writing. His stories generally were filled with people, actually sort of based on actual events and filled with people that he knew. So that raises the interesting question, did Dolores Cass, who shows up in a number of these stories, was she based on an actual person? And if so, one of the things that's revealed in this is that she had been a a student at Radcliffe. And at the time, Radcliffe was sort of the female auxiliary to Harvard. And it was, I think, lecturing to a Radcliffe class that Münsterberg dies. So could she have been there? Was she, in the stories, she's Simon If's accomplice? Was she Crowley's accomplice? And because there are all kinds of ways to provoke a heart attack if one wants to, and Crowley was quite expert with what sort of things? Well, drugs. Okay, he spent a lot of time taking them, and he also was always evaluating their effect on people. I think more than likely Hugo Münsterberg, the simplest way to explain it is that he died of a heart attack that was brought on by existing medical conditions, and it was just a coincidence. Always come back to the question, what is a coincidence?
So Magic with a K is Aleister Crowley's specific change in how it was going to be presented as magic as Crowley understood it versus legerdemain, sleight of hand, stage magic, things like that. Your David Blaine's and David Copperfields of the world. That's stage magic. They're specifically tricking you, right? They're everything from card tricks to levitation to whatever it might be. These weren't really of interest to Crowley. And he was really interested in the occult science of magic.
So let's go back for a second and remind ourselves of what Aleister Crowley's definition of magic is. And I'm going to paraphrase, but essentially it boils down to causing change to occur in conformity with will. Making things happen because thinking about them and wishing them really, really hard. That you can change what happens in physical reality. You can manifest, ever heard that term? You can manifest the reality you want. So if you're Aleister Crowley and you believe that Münsterberg is the most dangerous German agent who ought to be removed, was his death not a poisoning, but the magical result of the application of will to cause change?
That significant day, when the Masters revealed their plan to continue using me, was breathlessly intense. The calm seemed to conceal some huge menace. It was as if the heart of the world had stopped. I have a powerful, instinctive feeling that I am myself an wholly electrical phenomenon, and the wilder the storm, the more completely do I feel myself in the element. Daylight had disappeared with the utmost suddenness. The storm struck deadly chill. A pall of purple-black drove down the valley at a height of scarce 100 feet above water. This pall was veined with a network of incessant lightning. It was the most spectacular performance I had ever seen. I was soaked and dripping before I got back to shelter. At this moment, a man and woman with a child asked leave to take refuge till the rain stopped. I showed them into the main room. Daylight had disappeared with the utmost suddenness. I decided to put on dry clothes. I had to take my dry clothes into the bedroom. As I bent down, I noticed, with what I can only describe as calm amazement, that a dazzling globe of electric fire was stationary about 6 inches below and to the right of my right knee. I felt a very slight shock in the middle of my right hand. It is as if the flash of illumination interpenetrated my spirit.
Perhaps Crowley didn't need a Charles Fort, because Crowley himself was a lightning rod for the strange and anomalous. His experience with ball lightning was followed only a few days later by his Cross of the Frog ceremony. This ceremony would give him his sorely needed break from the past to continue his mission, magical or otherwise. 1 week after that, on July 23rd, Crowley's diary indicates Mercury on the spot during a mysterious visit to Boston. Lovecraft correspondent Myrta Alice Little was teaching south of the city at the time.
Remember I mentioned that Crowley was working on the Simon If stories, and he was populating it with figures from more, I would say, more his experience than his imagination. And that one of these was the somewhat mysterious female character of Dolores Cass. It shows up in a number of different stories in which he appears to be quite close to. One, she and her family had property in New Hampshire. She's also connected to Radcliffe. She almost certainly had met Münsterberg at one time or another. If there was a real-life model for Dolores Cass, and again, I think it's fair to say that to some degree there was, one possibility for that is a very real young woman at the time by the name of Myrta Little.